We come this morning to the final speech of the book of Job, and I dare say the most important of them all. In fact, you might argue it's the only one that really matters in all of this entire book. So we begin now into the final speech, going up to chapter 38 this morning and working our way to the end of the book. Now, it would be appropriate for me at this point to pause, as is typical of me, to review where we are at, because you might have missed the forest for the trees in all of this. And so let me remind you of where we are at. You remember in the first 5 verses of this book, we are introduced to Job. He is a man who is both wealthy and righteous. We see his life there in terms of who he was. And then in verse 6 of that first chapter, all the way through to 10, we, the readers of the book, not Job and his friends, but we get a glimpse into the heavenly councils that took place when God called his angelic messengers, including Satan, to come to him. And in each of the heavenly councils, it is God who proclaims something over Job. Have you considered my servant Job? Now, I've said many times, I'll repeat it again, that this is not an observation, this is a declaration, that God is not just observing something in Job, he is declaring it to be the case. Now, Satan questions this righteousness of Job, right? He claims, you just put a hedge around him, and so that's why he's righteous, and so God allows him to attack Job. But we know why all of this is taking place. As we've now talked about many, many times over the course of this book, we know that Job's righteousness is the declaration and purpose of God. And Satan can do nothing that will change the course of that reality. Satan cannot alter who Job is by nature. Oh, he's going to try. And he's going to use suffering of all kinds. He's going to use a wife and friends to all try to move him away from his status. But we know that it's God's intentions to show his purposes in Job. So as we move past the initial heavenly councils, then we move into the section of the speeches in this book. You remember the first one, Job chapter 3. Job just laments the fact that he's alive. He just says, I wish I'd never even been born. It would have been easier if I'd have just never been born. And then in chapters 4 through 25, great lengthy section of the book, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar attempt to persuade Job that his suffering has been caused by his own sin. You remember the primary thesis of his friends is, listen, the reason you're suffering is because you have sinned. So just go to the deity, confess your sin, and your suffering will go away. That was their intention. And you remember, as we worked our way through all of those speeches, they stuck to that. They stuck to that. They were not going to be moved off of that. But Job doesn't go there. He responds to each friend, slowly realizing that their answer is rather shallow and naive, and there must be more. Now, even though more comes to him, and even though he understands more, he still struggles to grasp the totality of what is taking place. He has a hard time, making peace, if you will, with the incongruity of his life, which he believed was righteous, and his suffering, and then juxtaposed against his friends that seem to want to say, listen, it's because it's all your fault. So in chapters 26 to 31, in a lengthy speech, Job makes his final appeal. He will again assert his righteousness. He will again say, yes, I am a righteous man. I have not sinned to deserve such suffering. But he will continue to lament that he has no way to defend his cause before an infinite God. Now, just stop for a second and think about that. Job is basically saying through all of these speeches, I know that my friends are wrong. I'm not suffering because of my sin. But I don't have anybody who's actually advocating for me. No one is willing to make my case before God. In fact, Job even goes so far as to say that even God doesn't make my case for me. And so he struggles through all of this. And then Job's other friend, one that's been just sitting there listening to all of this, in chapters 32 to 37, enters into the conversation himself. He suggests a little bit different tack than the other three did. He suggests that Job's quest for answers, right? Job's quest for answers, and even his own protestations of innocence, are misplaced. Right? Remember, he argued that Job is focusing on himself. Elihu turns the conversation towards God, turns it away from Job towards God, and rightly so, pointing out the justice and the greatness and the majesty of God are too great for the puny little needs of Job, or for the naive assumption of Job's friends, right? He says, listen, your problem is that you're thinking too small. It's not about you. It's about bigger things. Now, even Elihu doesn't get it all right. He's closer. He does turn the conversation, as I said, towards God, but he still doesn't understand the totality of what is taking place. Again, I would argue that Elihu is hamstrung with the same problems that all the others are, that they're not aware of what took place in all of the heavenly councils, not aware of all that. So I would summarize everything up to this point like this. Job is afflicted by God through Satan to demonstrate an eternal purpose. And Job and his friends try to figure out what it all means. But in the end, the friends' assertion is demonstrated to be false, and it's rejected. But while Elihu does point Job towards God, Job still comes up short in discerning the eternal purpose of his situation. He still comes up short in understanding the eternal point of what is taking place. Specifically, Job seems to justify himself over the sovereign purposes of God. That it's all about Job, rather than all about the sovereignty of God on display through him. And I would argue, if I might be so bold, I might argue that most of us have a tendency to approach Job in that fashion. We approach this book in that fashion. We have a tendency to look at this book and say, okay, the title of the book is Job. He seems to be the main character, so obviously the book's about him. What can we learn about him? That's how most people approach this book. But I hope that by now we have laid that to rest. And if we have not, we will now. Because now God will enter into the discussion. God will enter into the discussion. Okay, so with that as our review of where we have come from, getting us to this place, we have to stop before we actually go into this section, into this speech, and we need to consider a few things before so. It would be easy enough for us just to start reading the words, but let me take you into three considerations to look at as we enter into these speeches. Okay, first consideration is this, and I've said this from the very beginning of the book, and most people agree with me on this. There is no answer given by God as to why Job is suffering. Okay? Now, I'm going to put the word no in scare quotes here. Okay? Because while there is no answer, quote unquote, there is actually an answer if you're willing to listen for it. Okay? In other words, there is an answer here, but it's not the answer you're expecting. Now, true, there is no answer given by God explaining what purpose there is in Job's suffering. Okay, I get that. There's no specific answer given by God as to why Job is suffering. God never says, here's why you're suffering, and here's what I'm doing with it. Okay, you never see that in this speech. It's never going to be there. But let me suggest to you that's not really the question that's being asked, okay? That's not really the question that's being asked. It's not really the question even that we typically ask as we approach the book. Think about it for a second. We don't really approach this book asking, okay, why is Job suffering? We don't really approach it with that. We think we do, because we know the answer to the question. We know the reason why Job is suffering. Why is Job suffering? Because Job is a man who lives in a fallen world, and everyone who lives in a fallen world suffers. There's a universality to suffering, and we all know it to be the case. And even as Christians, as we approach this book and asking this question about suffering, even for those of us who are the adopted sons and daughters of God, we know that suffering is often, as we see in Hebrews chapter 12 and elsewhere, often designed for our growth. It's often designed to push us to trust God even more. The writer of Hebrews is talking about discipline in Hebrews 12 by using the things of this world to discipline us, to unhook us from the temptations and sins which are common to us and bring us to a place where we are holy. So sometimes God sends suffering, and we know it. Sometimes God sends suffering in order to grow us up in Him, to trust Him in the midst of our difficulties. So, in other words, we really don't even ask the question, why is Job suffering? Because we inevitably know the answer to the question. We know that men suffer because it is what they are ordained to do in a fallen world, and even ordained to do as followers of the living God. Okay? So, most of the time when people come to this book looking at an answer for suffering, they're really asking a different question. May I suggest to you what the real question is that they're asking? The real question is this: who are you? And who gave you permission to make me suffer? You see? It's a different question, isn't it? Most people are not really coming looking for an answer to, okay, tell me why Job's suffering, because we know the answer to that. Really what we do is we approach this book with this question: who gave you permission to make my life miserable? Because you see, I'm the God of my life. I'm the one in control of my life. How dare you do what you want in me? Now, this is fundamental to the human race, isn't it? It's the very core of what happened in the fall, that men believe that they are God. The devil said to our first parents, right? You will be like God. And we think we are. And so now in our fallen and sinful state, we look upon suffering and we say, well, yes, I realize that suffering's endemic to the human race, but how dare you bring suffering into my life? Now, we may not ask it as, as coarsely as that, right? We may couch it in such things as, oh, I don't understand why I'm suffering like this, and I don't understand what God is trying to do with this. But look, it boils down to the same thing every time. Our real question is, why do you, God, think that you have the right to do with me what you will? How dare you do what you want? And this is precisely the answer that God gives to Job. In fact, this is the question. This is exactly the answer. This is precisely the answer that God gives to Job. Let me tell you who I am. You're asking, who gave you permission to do this? Let me tell you who I am. You're asking, how dare you do in my life these things which I have not agreed to? God says, okay, let me show you who I am. You see, I think if we would approach this book with that kind of honesty, we would discover that the book has real, genuine meaning, instead of being some ignored backwater book sitting in the Old Testament that nobody seems to care about anymore. Because here is God about to say, let me tell you why I have the authority to do as I will in this world. Let me tell you why. Because it is, in fact, the problem, the very problem of Job and his friends. When you think about it, it's really the problem of Job and his friends. What does Job's friends say? It's your fault. And God says, no, it's not. It never was. Oh, it's Satan's fault. No. So the first consideration is to recognize that what we're talking about here is not why is there suffering, because there's really no answer given, but the real question is, who gave you permission to do these things? And that's what God's going to take up. Which leads to the second consideration, and this is something that Calvin says in his 147th sermon from this book, in the beginning of chapter 38. In fact, the first 4 verses of this book, Lord willing, we'll look at this morning. Here's what he points out. And I want you to think about this, because when I read this, it's like, you know what? I don't think I've ever thought of that before. In fact, there's a lot of things I've read about Calvin in the course of Job that I have not thought about before. Here's what Calvin says. Think about this for a second. God chooses to use men to bring his word to us. And he does this out of pity. God chooses to use men to bring his word to us, and he does this out of pity. However, when God really wants to get our attention, he comes down to us in power. Now, what do you mean by pity? Well, Calvin puts it like this. God has pity on us when he ordains men who are ministers of his word to teach us. And you know why? Because he knows our limits. And he knows that we would be overwhelmed by his majesty and destroyed by his glory if he taught us directly. If he showed up, the God of glory, and stood before us in all of his majesty and all of his might and all of his beauty and all of his radiance and all of what he is, if Yahweh stood right here in this place and spoke, we would all be destroyed. So instead, he comes down to our level in using foolish preachers. He sends Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and Elihu first, because he has pity on Job, because he has pity on the man. Paul tells us, you remember in 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse 27, that it is the foolishness of preaching, the foolishness of men like me, standing in front of you and articulating truths that protects us, so to speak. It protects us. God says, let me use that foolish guy in a suit and tie to tell you some truths, because if I show up, this is God speaking, if I show up, you're going to be overwhelmed. But you might actually survive him. Although many times you wonder sometimes, right? So God has pity on us, but we also need to be touched once in a while so that we will revere him as he deserves. So sometimes God says, well, you know what? They're just not getting it. The preacher has spoken. He has said what I have told him to say. He has brought my word to bear, but they're just not there yet. So I'm going to exercise some power to add to the preacher. You see, since Job was not sufficiently convinced by the arguments of Elihu, nor even by considering his own suffering, God makes him aware of his greatness by means of a whirlwind, so that Job would be frightened in such a way that he would give in and acknowledge his error and fully obey what was put before him. Here's how Calvin puts it. He says, quote, "That is the first thing we have to note about this passage." Now remember, this is from the very first words of chapter 38. This is the first thing we have to note about this passage, namely that when God speaks to us by the mouth of men, it is so that we will approach him more freely, that we will more easily receive what he offers us, and not be unduly astonished. I'll pause there. Yeah, none of you are unduly astonished by me. Okay, good. But since we are thick-skinned and do not give him the honor he deserves, he makes us aware of who he is and presents himself in his majesty to persuade us to pay him homage. End quote. So sometimes, most of the time, God speaks through us, through men. But once in a while, he comes to speak more directly in order to make sure that we don't miss it. Which implies, by the way, that sometimes the storms of life are designed to show us the greatness of God. Sometimes the storms of life, metaphorically speaking, are designed to frighten us out of our complacency. Sometimes God shows up in order to make sure that we've gotten the point. Now, let me just pause here and insert something that should become obvious right about here, and that is something we know, that God himself, God himself bridged the gap between human preaching and a divine presence in the incarnation of the Son. See, God wasn't satisfied to just send men to preach. He sent a man who was also himself. He bridged that gap. He bridged that gap. Jesus Christ, the God-man, preached to us that we might hear God without fear. See it? God comes to us. If he came to us in the fullness of his power and majesty, we would be destroyed. But he still wishes to speak to us directly through his own lips. So what does he do? He enters into a man. He becomes a man. He robes himself in flesh, and he steps into the world, and he says, I have spoken. And so we can listen to him and hear the voice of God and see the glory of Yahweh, and yet not be afraid, not be overwhelmed, not be destroyed by this one. He embodies the fullness of the divine glory that we might fear God as well. So on the one hand, he comes as a man so that we can listen to him and not be afraid, and yet at the same time, we see the fullness of the glory of God and we can fall down and worship him. He bridges that gap between the two. As the writer of Hebrews says at the opening of his great book, long ago at many times and in many ways, God spoke to our fathers by the prophets. In these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world. The incarnate one comes to speak to us as a man in order that we might hear him, in order that we might not be afraid of listening to the words of God. He comes as the ultimate preacher because he says the very words of God himself, and yet at the same time, he comes as the fullness of the Godhead, the very creator himself, and so we see his divine majesty and power. and we know who God is. So yes, God condescends to speak through human messengers, but sometimes he shows up in power. Sometimes in storms, but primarily in his Son. And next week, the first week of Advent, we'll begin considering the fact that this one, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, entered into this world to speak to us, to come and reveal to us the fullness of God. But there's a third consideration I would have you to think about even as we approach these words. And I will confess that I have struggled with this for a while, and my struggle has been to not let this go too early. Okay, I've been thinking about this for a while. And I think some of you have as well, because a couple of you have caught me out a couple of times along the way, and I've had to go, wait for it. And I want to explain what I'm talking about here is I want to talk about the distinction, or I should say the relationship between natural revelation on the one hand and special revelation on the other. All right? When I say natural revelation, when theologians speak of natural revelation, they speak about what can be known about God through observation of the natural world. Thus, natural revelation. What can be gleaned about the nature of God, or the fact that there is a God, from examining the world. And most importantly, and I think most significantly, many natural theologians ignore this, but the Bible is clear that probably the greatest source of our understanding of the nature of God in the natural world is man, or better, the image of God in man. That we are unique amongst all the creatures of this planet. There are many things about us that are unique. I was thinking just this week about a story that I heard, and I thought of this. Do any other animals in the animal kingdom purposely take their own lives? See, but we do. We are unique in many ways. That, by the way, would be a byproduct of the fall. But nonetheless, we are unique amongst all the creatures of the world. So as we examine the world, as we examine ourselves, we come to the fact that there's an undeniable apologetic for God and his law in observation. Paul says it very clearly, right? In Romans 1:19 and following, right? There is a God and everybody knows it because the world screams out for the fact that there is a God. There are no atheists. There are only men suppressing the knowledge of God. They know it, they just suppress it. Probably the greatest example of this in my mind, well, not the greatest example, but a great example of this is the fact that here we have a man whose name was Cain. He lived thousands of years before the law was codified on Sinai, and yet he knew that killing his brother was wrong because he buried his brother in the ground. He knew, didn't he? How did he know that if there was no law given? And the answer is he knew it because it was in his soul. It was in his very nature as one created in the image of God. See, Job and his friends have full access to this level of understanding of God, right? Doesn't matter when you live, what time frame you live. This is a reality in all of the world. They have full access to this level of understanding of God. I had considered the possibility of spending a few minutes talking about this. I'll just pass it by you and let you think about it. And just stop thinking about it now. You can think about it later. Do they have greater access to natural revelation than we do? Good question, right? I mean, we have full access to special revelation. Do they have greater access to natural revelation than we do? Good for a debate at some point, maybe over Thanksgiving or over the Christmas table. Debate, right? So when we talk about natural revelation, we're talking about that which is inherent in nature and inherent in the image of man that makes us aware of the presence of God. But it's limited in that it does not give us all of what we need to know in order to come to this God in righteousness. The best that natural revelation can do is give us an understanding that there is a God and that there are certain expectations according to his law, but it cannot really tell us how to approach this God in such a way that we can approach him in holiness. And so that is why we need special revelation. And special revelation is the unique act of God, okay, notice how I put that, the unique act of God to reveal specifically what is needed beyond what is visible in creation. We can look around at creation and we can see all kinds of great things about God. He's a God of order, he's a God of majesty, he's a God of beauty, and so on. But it doesn't get us to that place of, okay, how do I know this God and him know me? That's where special revelation goes. It's a unique act of God himself to reveal specifically what is needed beyond what is visible. Things like his decree, his plan of redemption, his expectation of righteousness, and so on. All kinds of things that we have to have him tell us because we can't just glean it out of creation. It's the unique ways that God speaks directly to humans, okay? It's the unique way that God speaks directly to human beings. Some of the obvious examples of this special revelation are through Scripture, through prophets, and sometimes through direct contact with man. Scripture, prophets, and sometimes through direct contact with men. For example, you remember that God showed up and spoke to Abraham. Showed him a pot and a torch and, right? Passed between it, said, here I am, this is the covenant I'm making with you. He showed up to have special contact with him, to seal his covenant. You see that in Genesis chapter 15. So it's the unique ways that God speaks to us. Now, here's where I'm going to pull the trigger on what it is I've been thinking about. How is it then that Job's friends, Eliphaz, Bildad, Zophar, and Elihu, are able to quote bits of wisdom that are contained in special revelation, but not yet written down? Many commentators note this. You open the book of Job, open a commentary of the book of Job, one of the first things you're going to see is a question is, when was this book written? And there were a lot of people who say, well, it had to be written after Psalms and Proverbs were written because these men quote from the Psalms and Proverbs. Now, if I hold to my theory that this is actually written back in the days of Abraham, that the events, I should say, took place back in the days even before Abraham and written sometime in that, how is it possible that these friends are able to quote that? Is it possible that God has, in fact, been providing forms of special revelation to the generations prior to Moses so that men could fully know God and his ways even before the instantiation of the nation of Israel? Is it possible that God has already been speaking in those days? It hasn't yet been written down, but there it is. One example that someone in this audience keeps reminding me is Noah. What was he preaching for the 100 years that he was calling men to repentance while he was building that ark? What was he saying to them? And the answer, of course, has to be something related to, here's what you must do to come to this God, otherwise you are going to have to learn how to swim. How did Moses know the creation account? How did he know the specificity of those chapters? And the answer is, it is likely that these men have greater understanding because God has revealed some things to them as a part of his decree to work through Job. That God didn't just set in motion the events that we see in this book. He didn't just say to Satan, okay, go attack him, and then I'm just going to stand back and see what happens. That doesn't make sense. If God has purposed something to happen through Job, which seems to be obvious from the heavenly councils, then it also seems appropriate that God would be revealing certain things to be true, even through Job's friends, even though they don't get the conclusions right. How many times did we talk about this over the course of those speeches? They get a lot of things right. Their conclusions are wrong, but they have a lot of truth statements sprinkled in. How did they know those things? They knew them because God had, in fact, revealed some things to them as a part of his decree to work through Job, right? But now, God himself comes to speak. And he brings the ultimate special revelation to them. He has given them some things. But now he's going to give them the rest of the story. Now, as I said, I could have sprinkled that in over the course of many sermons through this course of this. But I really wanted to focus it here because this is where it fits the best. In my opinion, the speech of God in this section answers the question that God himself poses to Satan. And what was that question? Have you considered my servant Job? He is blameless and upright, fears God, and shuns evil. Have you considered him? We all look at that and say, oh, that was a question for Satan. Nope. That is an eternal question. It's beyond Satan. And God is going to come now and answer the question. Have you considered my servant Job? Have you considered this one that I'm working through? This one that I'm accomplishing something through? This one that I've declared to be righteous? This one that I've placed my hand to decree upon? Have you considered him? And if you have, what have you considered? If you have, what have you considered? And the answer he's going to give to the question, have you considered my servant Job, is this: because I am the sovereign one, I do with all things as I please. Have you considered my servant Job? What do you think about him? Well, here's what I think. You can do what you want, whenever you want. You can declare a man righteous, or you can leave a man in his sin. That's up to you. It's entirely up to you. See it? Isn't that remarkable? In other words, God now gives us the reason for the heavenly counsel. He gives us the reason for the righteousness of Job. He gives us the reason for the struggle that Job had with his friends. And he gives us the reason why this book is in the Bible. He comes and gives us a reason. He gives us the picture, the total picture of this. He reveals, finally, what it is, this book, those counsels, the question, all the speeches are all about. This is God coming to say, okay, you've been floundering around in the dark long enough. Let me tell you what the real story is here. You might make a very good argument that everything from chapter 3 to chapter 37 is basically just a whole lot of men floundering around in the dark, trying to figure out where up is up, and God comes along and says, enough of that. Here's the truth. Look, is that not the gospel? Is that not the gospel? Is that not the message of Christ? You people have been floundering around the dark for millennia, looking for an answer. I have the answer. For I am the way, the truth, and the life. And no one comes to the Father except by me. It's exactly the same, isn't it? It's exactly the same. Men punching at phantoms in the darkness, with certain amounts of revelation here and there along the way that God sprinkles in. But until God himself shows up, it's pointless. And we might even make that very personal in this way. You and I flounder around in the dark looking for answers until the Spirit of the living God comes and speaks. And when he speaks, what happens? He takes out the old heart. He puts in a new one. He turns our eyes to Christ. He calls us to him. And we know. We suddenly know. We didn't before. We do now. This is what you have. God shows up to answer his own question. His own question. So, that's what we're looking at in this tremendous speech that God is about to give. Now, let's structure this speech to make sure we know how we're going to work our way through it. The speech itself can be broken into two halves. It's easily divided, okay, to two simple halves. And there's a short response by Job in the very middle of it, all right? So it looks like this. In chapters 38 and 39, God asks Job a series of rhetorical questions about what he has created. About what he's created. And more specifically, if Job was involved in the design of each element. Now, he never comes right out and says that, right? Well, he does say, were you there, were you there? But his point is that the implication of it is, okay, this thing, or this thing, did you give me any help in designing that? Or did I do that on my own? Were you there? In many ways, you might look at the first half of this as basically Paul's great doxology at the end of his theological section in Romans chapter 11. Who has been the counselor of God, right? Who has given him advice? Who has God ever asked, what should I do? Okay? So the first half, 38 and 39, is the sovereignty of God over creation. The sovereignty of God over creation. In other words, since God is the sovereign creator, no one dares to question his power. And no one dares to question his morality either. Okay, keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. Nobody questions his power, but at the same time, nobody questions his morality. In other words, nobody questions whether or not he has the right to do what he does, and whether it is right when he does it or not. Nobody has the right to question that. And then in chapter 40, verses 1 to 5, right in the middle, God challenges Job to answer him in regards to what he has just said. And Job's response is this. I got nothing to say. I just put my hand over my mouth. Okay? I've got no defense. I've got nothing to say. But God's not finished speaking, so he completes his speech in chapters 40 and 41. And in this case, God rebukes Job for elevating himself to the position of God, asking another series of rhetorical questions regarding his power and position. Now, in this case, in the second half, he's going to be much more direct. In the first half, he's going to do it basically by implication. I created this. Were you there? I created this. Were you there? I created this. Were you there? Second half, he's going to go, were you there when I did this? Were you there when I did this? You see the difference? He's going to be a bit more subtle in the first half than in the second. And so in this case, the second half can be called the sovereignty of God over man. The first half, the sovereignty of God over creation. But the second half becomes the sovereignty of God over man himself. In other words, since God is the ruler of men, no one dares to question his authority or intentions. See, if God is the ruler over creation, nobody can question his power or morality. But in the second half is nobody can question his authority or his intentions. You don't have a right to tell God what he is allowed or not allowed to do, either as a rock or as a man. See it? So that's the structure of this speech. It's actually fairly straightforward. But let's look now at the beginning bits of it as we move into it. Now, it says in verse 1 of chapter 38 and verse 6 of chapter 40, beginning of the first half, beginning of the second half, both cases, that God answers Job out of the whirlwind. Out of the whirlwind. In each half, the writer, probably Job, notes that God speaks to Job from a whirlwind. God comes and he speaks to Job through a whirlwind. Now, it is interesting that Elihu, in the previous chapter, and someone's nodding his head over here because he goes, yes, I saw that already. That Elihu specifically compares God to the image of a storm. See, if you just go back, chapter 37, the first 5 verses. Verse 2, keep listening to the thunder of his voice and the rumbling that comes from his mouth. Under the whole heaven he lets it go, and his lightning to the corners of the earth. After it his voice roars, he thunders with his majestic voice. Elihu compares God to a storm. So in my ever so humble opinion, God hears this and shows up in exactly that way. It's almost as though he says, Elihu, I'll take it from here. I'll take it from here. In fact, I think he interrupts Elihu at this point in the same way that Job interrupted Bildad. Remember, when Job recognized that he wasn't getting any further with his friends, he cut Bildad off in the middle of his speech, and I think that's exactly what God does here. God comes along and says, okay, Elihu, stop talking. I'll take it from here. And he comes in the very form that Elihu's been speaking about in this fashion. Now, what we have here is a theophany. That's a big old word, but I love it. A theophany. It's an appearance of God to communicate with someone directly. A theophany is an appearance of God to communicate with someone directly. The word is similar to the word epiphany, has the same suffix, phany. It's like that. By the way, the epiphany has two different views in the church. In the West, the Epiphany, which is celebrated shortly after Christmas, is the appearance of the Magi to Christ. The celebration of the appearance of the Magi to Christ, and it's a celebration of the gospel going out to the Gentiles, because the Magi, you remember, were Persians who came as Gentiles to see this Christ. So it's a celebration of the gospel going to the Gentiles. In the Eastern Church, in the Orthodox Church, it's the appearance of Christ revealed as the Son in his baptism. Matthew chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. So in the East, it's seen more as Jesus appearing as he comes out of his childhood into his ministry. I'm inclined to see it that way myself more than the West does in terms of the Magi. I don't have any real connection of that biblically, but I do have that in the way the East sees it. A theophany, then, is the appearance of God rather than the appearance of Jesus, often in a non-human form, as here. Sometimes in human form. For example, when he wrestled with Jacob and lamed him in Genesis 32:24. And sometimes as what we call the angel of the Lord, who comes and appears. There's a great theophany in Genesis 16, one of my favorite theophanies in the Bible, when God, the second person of the Trinity, in my opinion, comes to Hagar in the wilderness as she's running away from Sarah. And he comes to her and he gives her the gospel. Where have you come from? Where are you going? Turn around and go back. So, a theophany is often a non-human form, sometimes in human form, and sometimes as the angel of the Lord. Now, those angelic appearances, by the way, are not to be confused with specific angelic appearances, such as Gabriel showing up to announce to Mary that she's going to be the mother of a child. That's not God showing up. That's an angel, a messenger. He has a name. Okay, so it's different. Okay, that's not a theophany. So God comes here to make an appearance, and he comes in a whirlwind. The Hebrew word that's used here, ara, means very simply a storm or a tempest. To be more specific, a swirling mass of air that moves at great speed. And, if I might be ironic, is also very destructive. It's a tornadic weather event. A tempest strong enough, a whirlwind strong enough to act as a destructive spinning of air. When you think of that, you think of two main things, right? You think of tornado or hurricane. Those two kinds of things. They're the same basic phenomenon, weather-wise. It just size is different, right? And by the way, there were hurricanes on the Mediterranean. They were much smaller than we would have in the Gulf of Mexico, but there were hurricanes. In fact, I think that's what Paul was swept up in when he was on his way to Rome. I think that's what Jonah was swept up in as he was trying to run away from God. I think God sent him in a little hurricane there to do what he wished. It's the same word, by the way, that's used to describe how Elijah was taken up to heaven in 2 Kings 2:11. It's the exact same word, a whirlwind. Some sort of atmospheric thing that took Elijah right off the planet. And it's the opposite of the still small voice that Elijah heard in the cave in 1 Kings 9:12. It's the opposite of that. So a whirlwind is a mighty, noisy thing that's destructive. The still small voice was like a wind, but very small and non-destructive. In fact, very similar to the mighty rushing wind that was heard by the disciples on Pentecost in Acts chapter 2. A wind of some sort. Now again, in Acts chapter 2, it's probably not an actual wind, probably just the sound of one, but nonetheless. In other words, it's a physical manifestation of the presence of God from which comes forth God's voice. A physical manifestation of some sort from which God's voice comes forth. Very much like, as you remember, the fire of the burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. A bush that burns but is not consumed by the fire, and out from that fire comes the voice of God. In my ever so humble opinion, this is the third person of the Trinity that comes to speak to Job. The third person of the Trinity in a non-corporeal form. Jesus says in John chapter 6:46 that no one has seen the Father. Typically, the Son in Scripture appears in human form as he will become incarnate in the flesh. Thus, it is the Spirit that appears in forms like fire and wind, or even as a dove at Jesus' baptism, which I spoke of a few moments ago. Now, I realize we would have a tendency to see this as the Father, right? Now, many of you don't even think of Trinitarian terms here, which is your mistake, okay? You gotta think of Trinitarian terms. Oh, God just showed up. Yeah. But God is personal. If he's going to speak, okay, who's doing the speaking? Which person? We might have a tendency to think of it as the Father, given the creation focus in the speech, right? Given the fact he talks about all the things he created. But a proper Trinitarianism reminds us to see the fullness of the Godhead in the Spirit who can speak for the Godhead. Even as he does in Scripture, right? 2 Timothy 3:16. All Scripture is theopneustos, breathed out by God. Who did that? The Spirit of God does this. The third person of the Trinity comes to bring this. In fact, if we're going to talk about creation narratives, we know that the third person was instrumental in the creation, was he not? I mean, according to the second verse, he's hovering there over the water. He's a part of the whole thing. In other words, this is the pneuma. This is the breath of God, which comes to Job to speak for the triune God, just as he did to Moses in the bush, and even as he does now through the word, breathing out faith through the preacher. The Spirit of God does that. It's the Spirit who comes down and speaks. Paul himself says it in Romans chapter 10, 13 to 17. So literally what we have is we have some sort of atmospheric event from which the Spirit speaks, but there's a metaphorical picture painted here as well that I don't want you to miss. God comes in a whirlwind. Just as Job and his friends were going round and round, trying to find answers to the dilemmas that they had, chasing after their theories, God intervenes with a pure whirlwind to finish the discussion. It's almost like God saying, yeah, okay, you guys can go round and round and round all you want to, but I'm going to really go round and round and round. I'm going to show you the truth from that. That's one metaphorical thing to consider. But another is this, and I mentioned it a moment ago. God's word here comes to destroy the lofty arguments of Job and his friends. God now speaks, and the true nature of the situation is revealed, as I said earlier. And the speculations and the lofty arguments of these men are blown away. God comes with a big wind to destroy their lofty arguments. So what we have here is God showing up. Here's God coming. Here's God coming to speak. Here's God coming to say, okay, you've done your talking. You've had your theories. You've taken what I've given to you as truth and tried to use it to come up with an answer. But you need for me to speak, and so now I'm going to speak. I'm going to put to rest all of these things. And I'm going to give you the answer to the question that I myself have posed. I do find it somewhat interesting that Job doesn't even know that question. He doesn't need to. The question gives the answer. The answer gives the question automatically in itself. So God shows up to speak. And in chapter 38, in verse 3, he says to Job, dress for action like a man, which is similar to saying, gird up your loins. So my friends, gird up your loins, for here we go.